Welcome back to my inner sanctum. I'm your hostess, Countess Elizabeth, mistress of the macabre. The FBI estimates that there are between 25 and 50 serial killers operating throughout the United States at any given time. Serial homicide is a curious part of society. Essentially, these people act as interspecies predators who hunt other humans. We shall consider them the damned for their horrific actions. This series will cover the crimes of the damned, bringing to light the gory details of their hollow existence. Today, my fiends, we will be looking into the crimes of Dennis Rader, otherwise known as the BTK killer. So, let us take a journey through hell and enter the world of the damned, so we can explore our grotesque curiosity. Dennis Rader was born on March 9th, 1945. He's an American serial killer known as BTK. BTK is an abbreviation he gave himself that stands for bind, torture, kill, which is essentially what he did to his victims. Between 1974 and 1991, Rader killed 10 people in Wichita and in Park City, Kansas, and sent taunting letters to police and newspapers describing the details of the crimes. His motives for the murders were to satisfy his sadistic sexual fantasies. After a decade-long hiatus, Rader resumed sending letters in 2004, which led to his 2005 arrest and subsequent guilty plea. Rader always harbored sadistic sexual fantasies about torturing trapped and helpless women. While this was Dennis Rader's fantasy world, he learned early to live a double life. His friends describe him as just one of the guys. He just sort of blended in. One friend described him as utterly lacking a sense of humor, but tending to be studious and focused. He had a brief stint in the Air Force, and after that, returned to Wichita, got married, and couldn't hold down a job. Because of the job loss, he found himself in a low frame of mind, unemployed, unhappy, with all kinds of time on his hands. He slipped deeper into the fantasy world he had known since childhood, and wanted to know what would it feel like to strangle somebody to death. In January 1974, he began what he called trolling, which consisted of driving or walking around certain neighborhoods or school campuses where there would be women to observe. He would focus in on a target and enter his fantasy realm of bondage, torture, and death, imagining what he would do to her. Rader claims, "I have many what I call them projects. There were different people in town that I followed, watched. It's just basically a selection process. Worked towards it. If it didn't work, I just move on to something else. You go through trolling stage, and then a stalking stage." Rader had so many projects that he had project numbers and names assigned to his potential victims. While he was out on one of these trolling adventures, Rader noticed that there was a new Hispanic family that moved into a corner house on Edgemore and Murdoch, and one day he spied Julie Otero, age 34, and her daughter Josephine, age 11. Rader devised a plan. He gathered together what he called his hit kit, which consisted of a gun, cord, knives, and various tools for breaking and entering. He would also wear different sets of clothes, just for his criminal activities. He observed the Otero house for a time, getting an idea of when people left or returned, and what their daily schedule was like. One morning on January 15th, he couldn't wait any longer. At 8 a.m., he came around the house, snuck into the yard, and cut the phone line, hesitating at the back door. Unsure if he would go through with it, he barged in, but things didn't go exactly to plan. The man of the house, Joe Otero, who was 38, was still home, as was Julie, Josephine, and Joey, the 9-year-old son. Rader didn't expect Joe Otero to be home. Their rather vicious dog was also in the house. Rader seized control of the situation, ordering Joey to put the dog in the backyard at gunpoint. He somehow was able to control all 4 people using the gun. He told them he was a wanted criminal and needed money, food, and a car to escape, and not to be alarmed. This story is what he used in all of his murders. At first, Joe was dumbfounded and asked if this was some kind of joke set up by his brother-in-law. Rader ordered everyone to lie down in the living room, but then changed his mind and sent them all to the bedroom. Rader later testified, "I realized that, I didn't have a mask on or anything. They could already ID me. I made the decision to go ahead and put him down, I guess, or strangle them." As Joe was lying on the floor, Rader put a bag over Joe's head. Joe fought hard, tearing holes in the bag. Rader admitted, "First of all, Mr. Otero was strangled, a bag put over his head and strangled, and I thought he was going down. I had never strangled anyone before, so I really didn't know how much pressure you had to put on a person or how long it would take." When he attempted to manually strangle Julie, Rader testified, "I thought she was down. Then I strangled Josephine. I thought she was down. And then I went over to Junior and put the bag on his head. After that, Mrs. Otero woke back up and, she was pretty upset. So I came back and at that point, I strangled her to death. Before she died, she had begged Rader not to kill the children and told him, 'God have mercy on your soul.'" 9-year-old Joey was the next one to die. Rader suffocated him as well. 11-year-old Josephine was the next victim. After the failed attempt at strangulation, Josephine regained consciousness. Rader forced her to walk down to the basement. He put a noose around her neck and informed her that she was going to heaven to join the others. He asked her for a camera, but she didn't have one. This would be a common reoccurrence in his murders, to have a photo taken of the victim, or for Rader to draw pictures of the victims. He hanged Josephine from a sewer pipe in the basement, partially disrobed. Rader then did sexual things to himself over her bare legs, leaving some of his male DNA on a pipe behind her. Afterwards, Rader tidied up a bit, collected his things, and left after a time. He took Joe's watch and a small radio. He testified later that he would take trophies from his murders if he had enough time. He then got into their Oldsmobile station wagon, backed onto Murdoch Street, and nearly had a collision with an oncoming vehicle. Rader drove to a nearby supermarket, Dillon's, and parked the car. He stealthily tossed the keys on top of the roof of Dillon's and exited the area on foot. After that, he claims he walked to his own car, but he realized his knife was missing. He claims to have driven back to the Otero house, parking his car in the garage, and then retrieved the knife from the yard. When the Otero's 3 other children arrived home from school that afternoon, they found their parents dead. In April 1974, Rader was stalking a woman named Catherine Bright, who was 21. He had seen her one day, entering the home she rented in Wichita. On April 4th, he broke into the home via the back porch door. He hid in the bedroom. About 2 p.m., Catherine arrived home, accompanied by her brother Kevin, who was 19 years old. Kevin didn't live there, but he had gone with his sister that day to the bank. Rader startled them by emerging from the bedroom, pointing a gun at them. He recited the same story he told the Oteros, that he was a wanted criminal from California, on his way to New York, and needed a car and money. Rader forced the 2 of them in a bedroom where Catherine was tied up at gunpoint. He attempted to tie Kevin up in another room, but he hadn't brought his best hit kit materials that day, and had to improvise with materials found in the home. Here's Rader testifying to this.
Let me ask, you indicated you had some items to tie these people with. Did you bring these items, both the Oteros and to this location?
The Oteros I did. I'm not really sure on the Brights. There was some, when I was working with the police, there was some controversy on that. Probably more likely I did, but if I had brought my stuff and used my stuff, Kevin would probably be dead today. I'm not bragging on that, it's just a matter of fact. It's the bonds I tied him up with that he broke them, so.
All right.
And maybe same way with Catherine. It was.
Kevin worked his way loose and got into a vicious fight for his life with Rader, nearly succeeding in taking the gun from him. Rader grabbed the gun back and got off a shot that hit Kevin in the face. Still fighting, Kevin made one more attempt to overpower Rader, but got shot in the head a second time. Stunned and bleeding, Kevin appeared to be dead or dying, and Rader went back to work on Catherine. Catherine gave him a powerful fight also, but in order to end the scene quickly, Rader switched from attempted strangulation to stabbing, getting her with deep cuts to the abdomen and other areas. Meanwhile, Kevin had revived and ran out of the house screaming for help. Because of this, Rader made a hasty exit, and as he did, he ran from the scene on foot. He ran many blocks to where his car was parked and drove off. He was able to change from his clothes that he would wear for crimes, and was all cleaned up by the time his wife got off work. No one suspected him. Catherine died in the hospital a few hours later. Kevin was left in critical condition with his head wounds, but survived. He still bears the damage done to him that day. October 1974 was when Rader first expressed his need for recognitions of his crimes by sending letters. In this Catch Me If You Can game, he called an editor of the Wichita Eagle newspaper and directed him to a letter hidden in an engineering book in the Wichita Public Library. The editor notified the police instead, who found the letter at the library. It was a gruesome description of the unsolved Otero murders by someone with good knowledge of the crime scene. It was written in poor English with numerous misspellings. The writer was concerned that the police had recently arrested the wrong men for the Otero murders, and proudly proclaimed, "I did it myself with no one's help," he said. "The code words for me will be bind them, torture them, kill them. BTK. Rader gave himself the name of BTK in this letter. Going into the psychological aspects of Rader, This letter, along with all the other correspondence, relates to his extreme narcissism. Following his 7th murder, which I will go into details with shortly, Rader sent a letter to authorities where he asked, "How many do I have to kill before I get a name in the paper or some national recognition?" This statement indicates just how much he craved attention for himself. As determined by the court-appointed psychiatrist later on, Rader is an obsessive psychopath with narcissistic tendencies. And Rader sees himself as a natural-born predator who is no more responsible for killing than a venomous snake or a shark. In fact, he attempts to neutralize his responsibility for his murders by claiming he was compelled to kill by something called Factor X, that is, an insatiable urge to kill that he does not comprehend. Going back to events in his life, in November 1974, Dennis Rader found himself a steady job with ADT Security, a company specializing in the installation of alarm systems. He would stay with ADT for the next 14 years. He rose to the position of installation supervisor, which gave him some flexibility in terms of where he could be during the day, and this job also allowed him to be inside some of his victims' homes, sometimes installing alarms in the very homes he would sometimes troll. Rader used autoerotic fantasy and would do sexual things to himself, aided by the trophies from his victims, to relive the crimes and satisfy his sexual cravings in between murders. As a result of his autoerotic fantasy life, the length of time or cooling off period between BTK's murders was highly variable and generally much longer than most other serial killers. Incredibly, Rader takes credit for his fantasy rituals and even claims that they saved lives. He explains that it's likely he would have killed more people if he had not discovered a way to satisfy his urges. In one of the letters to the authorities, he wrote, "I can't stop it. The monster goes on. It hurts me as well as society. Society can be thankful that there are ways for people like me to relieve myself at times by daydreaming of some victims being tortured and being mine." In his psychopathic delusions, Rader seems to believe that society owes him a debt of gratitude for not killing more frequently than he did. Such twisted reasoning almost defies comprehension. Even though he's not known to have committed any known crimes during 1975 and 76, he never stopped trolling for more victims until his arrest 30 years later. He even admitted he was planning on killing again when he got caught. In a sense, the cooling down periods where he would just troll was more like a courting ritual or foreplay to BTK. He would get to know his intended prey and fantasize about what he would do once they were alone together. Although this new perspective on the cooling down period may not apply to all serial killers, it certainly contributes to our understanding the pathology of BTK. On March 17, 1977, Rader decided it was time for a murder one way or another. Rader visited 2 houses this night, but nobody was home, so he went out trolling on foot on Hydraulic Street. Rader encountered a 5-year-old boy, Steve Relford. He pulled out a photo of his own wife and son and asked Steve if he knew who they were. Steve said he didn't. During Rader's confession, he testified that he did this to pose as an official person, like a detective or a police officer, to gain the boy's trust. Steve then proceeded on home. Rader followed him and soon knocked on the door, and Steve answered. Still posing as a detective, he gained entry into the home. There were 3 children in the home, including Steve and an 8-year-old brother and 4-year-old sister. Rader abruptly turned off the television and lowered the blinds. The mother emerged in a bathrobe, demanding to know what was going on. He made his intentions clear to the mother, Shirley Vian, that he was going to tie her up and have his way with her. Rader claimed that he allowed her to smoke to calm down. At gunpoint, Rader ordered the children into the bathroom, where he forced Shirley to help him barricade the children in there. Rader tied her up just as promised, but then put a bag over her head and strangled her to death with a cord. He left male DNA on her underwear found next to the body. He was gone before the children could break out of the bathroom and summon help. Rader later claims that a ringing telephone unnerved him and caused him to leave before he could kill the children. In December 1977, Rader became fixated on Nancy Fox, who was 25. He then started to stalk her, so he checked her mail to find out her name and where she worked. Nancy was the sole occupant of a duplex at the time and lived alone. On the evening of December 8, 1977, Rader went to her place and noticed nobody was home as Nancy was at work, so he cut the phone lines and broke in via a rear bedroom window and waited in her kitchen for her to come home. Rader confronted her at gunpoint in the kitchen. Rader then stated that he had a sexual issue and needed to tie her up and rape her. He claims that he let her smoke a cigarette and she cooperated with him and didn't fight back. Rader then took a pair of handcuffs and handcuffed her, tied up her legs, and then strangled her with a belt. He then posed her dead body in a way that he found sexual and left his male DNA deposited on a nightgown found next to the body. The following morning, after reporting to work at ADT and leaving the office in a company van, Rader stopped at a phone booth just a couple of blocks down the street. He dialed 911 and said, Yes, you will find a homicide in 843 South Pershing. Nancy Fox. That's correct. And then left the receiver dangling. Police rushed to the residence and found the lifeless body still laying on the bed, the head badly swollen. A tape of that recording was eventually played over and over in the Wichita media, but no one, including Rader's coworkers or family, were able to recognize the voice. In early 1978, Rader attempted to send a postcard with a sarcastic poem, Shirley Locks, to the Wichita Eagle, but no one recognized the significance of it until days later. It was followed by a letter that was taken quite seriously. In it, the killer took full responsibility for the Otero, Shirley, Vian, and Nancy Fox murders, plus an unnamed seventh murder later assumed to be Catherine Bright. The writer suggested a number of names for himself, including BTK. It was written in the same style as the 1974 letter, and mentions the mysterious Factor X that the writer said was the reason for his need to kill people. Also included was a bizarre poem, "Oh Death to Nancy," mimicking an old folk song and poem called "Oh Death." This letter forced the Wichita Police Department to make a decision. It was decided that it would be publicly announced that Wichita had an unknown serial killer on the loose, and citizens were urged to be extra careful about locking their doors and looking out for each other. In June 1978, Paula gave birth to Rader's second and final child, Carrie. His wife had been pregnant during the events and following Nancy Fox's murder. In April 1979, Rader broke into the home of Anna Williams, a 63-year-old widow who had recently lost her husband. He waited fruitlessly for Anna to come home, but she didn't until after Rader left. Rader stole a few small items and left, disappointed. Rader explained during his confession that he became obsessed with Williams and was absolutely livid when she evaded him. In June of that year, Anna received a package in the mail with a poem entitled, "Oh Anna, Why Didn't You Appear?" She also received a drawing of what Rader intended to do to her, and a few other things which he had stolen. The next day, a similar package arrived at the studios of KAKE-TV in Wichita. Anna was terrified and quickly moved far away from Wichita. Then things went quiet. Nothing more was heard from the killer publicly until 2004, though he did kill again in 1985. Rader continued his trolling while becoming more active in his church, and also became a Cub Scout leader when his son was old enough. He would continue to live this double life as a family man and a good father. When he was arrested for the BTK killings, it shocked everyone, as he seemed like a normal guy. His daughter had even stated her childhood seemed normal and that they were the normal American family. However, psychologically for Rader, this was far from the truth, as he would eventually be diagnosed as an obsessive-compulsive psychopath with narcissistic tendencies. This is a person who has no problem with hurting others, no guilt, shame, or remorse. It is a person who is deceptive, lies freely and skillfully without shame or regret. The conventional social realm everyone lives in, and his own private world of torture and death. He was extremely skillful in separating these two worlds, what is known as compartmentalizing. He could go out and commit the most atrocious murder, and then come home like nothing happened. It was like changing clothes or switching to a different channel. Maureen Hedge, who was 53, was a widowed neighbor who lived on the same street in Park City as the Raders. She was a petite, friendly woman, mother of 4 grown children, who had lost her husband Thomas in the past year. Rader would troll her from his house and just watch her coming and going. On the weekend of April 27th, 1985, Rader was attending a Boy Scout campout just outside of Wichita. He left the camp that evening with the pretext of having a headache and needing to go to town to buy something for it. He parked his car by a bowling alley in the city and bought himself a beer. He swished the liquid in his mouth and spit it out, and also deliberately got some beer on his clothing so he would smell like he was drinking. Calling a cab, he pretended to be drunk and instructed the driver to drop him off at a park in Park City so he could walk it off before arriving home. He went through all of that just so he could be let out at the park, which adjoined the backyard of the Hedges property. Rader was disappointed to see Maureen's car in the carport and assumed she was home. He had cut the phone line and had quietly pried open a rear door using a screwdriver. It turned out that no one was home as he had hoped, and soon a car pulled up and Rader hid in the bedroom closet. Maureen had company, so Rader chose to stay in the closet until her company left. Eventually, Rader crept out of the closet. He flicked on the bathroom light and then pounced on Maureen in bed, manually choking the 100-pound woman to death. However, his fantasy-driven outing was far from over. He dragged the body with the bedding to her car and then put her in the trunk. Rader drove directly to his church, where he was a person so trusted he had the keys to the building. He then dragged the body down the basement and photographed it in various poses. After this, he found a dumping place in a ditch along a dirt road several miles outside of Park City, and semi-concealed the body under some trimmings. He was never connected to this crime until some 20 years later. He still had the photographs in his collection. In September 1986, Rader had his eye on Vicki Wegerle, a 28-year-old mother of two. On September 16th, sometime after 10 p.m., he showed up at Vicki's door, dressed up like a telephone repairman, complete with the hard hat and briefcase. He somehow managed to get Vicki to allow him inside the home to check the phone line. After pretending to look at the phone, he drew his pistol and told her to get in the bedroom with him. He attempted to tie her up using material from the bedroom, but she got loose and gave him a fierce battle, scratching him in the process. Rader prevailed in the physical fight, and then proceeded to strangle her using pantyhose. He thought she was dead, so he arranged her body in a sexual way and photographed her in a few poses, and hastily left in her car. Before being strangled, Vicki had warned Rader that her husband would be arriving shortly. Her husband Bill indeed came home soon afterwards, and even saw his own car going in the opposite direction from the house. He couldn't identify the driver, but it didn't appear to be Vicki. His 2-year-old son, Brandon, was still in the living room, unattended. Bill couldn't find Vicki at first, until he found her on the bedroom floor behind the bed. She was rushed to hospital, with paramedics desperately trying to revive her, as she was only unconscious, but was eventually pronounced dead a short time later. Bill was the one who was actually suspected of killing Vicki. The suspicion never left until BTK admitted to killing her. Rader was working on another project in January 19, 1991. Now 45 years old, he was wary of projects involving younger women, or where a male was present. He saw older women as more vulnerable. Encounters with younger ladies had proven difficult when they fought back, and the males were just obstacles in the way of his intended conquests. Rader focused his attentions on an older woman who lived alone, 62-year-old Dolores Davis, who lived close to him, but they didn't know each other. He pretty much did the same MO, and broke into her house by shattering a glass door with a concrete block. He ended up tying her up and strangling her to death. In 2004, the 30th anniversary of Rader's first murders, a local paper ran a feature in which it speculated that the killer was either dead or had been imprisoned. Rader was furious about these claims, and in what must have been a narcissistic rage, Rader then initiated a series of 11 communications to the local media. In March 2004, the Wichita Eagle received a letter from someone using the return address Bill Thomas Kilman. The author of the letter claimed he had murdered Vicki Wegerle on September 16, 1986, and enclosed photographs of the crime scene and a photocopy of her driver's license, which had been stolen at the time of the crime. Before this, it had not been established that Vicki was killed by BTK. DNA collected from under Vicki's fingernails provided police with previously unknown evidence. They then began DNA testing hundreds of men in an effort to find the serial killer. Altogether, over 1,300 DNA samples were taken. For the next year, Rader sent packages to the media or simply left items around Wichita. He often used cereal boxes, possibly a reference to serial killer, to hold drawings, trophies, including photographs, written descriptions of the murderers, and even dolls posed to mimic various deaths. In January 2005, Rader attempted to leave a cereal box on a bed of a pickup truck at Home Depot in Wichita, but the box was discarded by the truck's owner. It was later retrieved from the trash after Rader asked what had become of the later message. Surveillance tapes of the parking lot from that date reveal a distant figure driving a black Jeep Cherokee, leaving the box in the pickup. In February 2005, more postcards were sent to KAKE, and another cereal box was left in a countryside location that was found to contain another bound doll, apparently meant to symbolize the murder of 11-year-old Josephine Otero. In his letter to the police, Rader asked if his writings, if put on a floppy disk, could be traced or not. The police answered his question in a newspaper ad posted in the Wichita Eagle, saying that it would be safe to use the disk. On February 16, 2005, Rader sent a purple floppy disk to Fox TV affiliate KSAS-TV in Wichita. Also enclosed were a letter, a gold-colored necklace with large medallion, and a photocopy of the cover of Rules of Prey, a 1989 novel about a serial killer. Police then found metadata embedded in a deleted Microsoft Word document that was, unknown to Rader, still stored on the floppy disk. The metadata contained the words, Christ Lutheran Church, and the document was marked last modified by Dennis. An internet search determined that Dennis Rader was the president of the church council. Dennis Rader was eventually put under surveillance. When police contacted him initially, they also saw that he drove a similar black Jeep Cherokee, like the one that was seen driven by the figure who put the cereal box in the truck. There was circumstantial evidence. Eventually, the police were able to obtain a warrant to test a pap smear taken from Rader's daughter. The DNA tests showed a familial match between the pap smear and the sample from Vicki Wegerle's fingernails. This indicated that the killer was closely related to Rader's daughter, and combined with other evidence, this was enough for the police to arrest Rader. Rader's DNA was eventually matched to the male DNA found at the crime scene of the Oteros, which he took credit for. He was arrested in February 2005. When he was arrested, officers asked him, "Mr. Rader, do you know why you're going downtown?" And Rader replied, "Oh, I have my suspicions." Rader eventually confessed to the crimes and expressed shock that the police had lied to him about the floppy disk being safe to send. In June, Rader pled guilty, and 2 months later he was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms. He's still in prison to this day. Well, that was truly a grotesque tale. I chose this case because of how much it represents the duality of the psychopath, with Rader having an ordinary family life, while at the same time having this need to target people for his own sexual needs. Rader knew what he was, and that he would just have kept killing if he had not been caught. He represents the classic case of psychopathy, with the way he lived a double life, with nobody knowing what he was really like. If he wasn't such a narcissist, then he might have gotten away with his crimes. But luckily, the police did manage to catch him. May the souls of his victims rest in peace. Thank you for watching the video. Subscribe, like, and share if you'd also like to keep exploring our grotesque curiosity. We'll meet again in the darkness of the night.